Hello, Charger fans. Welcome to another edition of the Guilty as Charged podcast. I am your host today, Kyle, and I am fired up to be talking about a topic today that I've kind of teased out in a couple of our previous videos, especially some of the live ones. One of my favorite things to do this off season when trying to evaluate our play from the season before has been rewatching that Week 18 Raider game. I know for a lot of us that sounds kind of crazy because it was such a heartbreaker. But I really felt like there were a lot of great takeaways within that game that build up some hope for this next season, especially in week one, with it being announced that the Raiders are going to be our, opening week game. Figured no time better than now to go ahead and break through some of my key points from that game, and hopefully it'll help us analyze why we made some of the offseason moves we did and why even in a terrible defensive year for us last year, there was actually a foundation laid that we might be able to build on. So without further ado, week 18, what we can learn from the week 18 heartbreak, breaking down our misconceptions of our defensive shortcomings. Now, I apologize. I wanted to get to this video sooner, but my lack of know-how and knowledge with putting together these videos made me way behind schedule. So hopefully I'll be able to pump out stuff like this for you in a much quicker fashion in the future as I'm learning and getting new software and getting new tools. But anyway, getting down to this, why I love Week 18 so much is for all intents and purposes, Week 18 was a playoff game to me. Now, I'm not giving the Chargers by any means an honorary, participation. Here's your, pseudo playoff berth award. But I just mean in terms of the gravitas of the situation, in terms of Herbert being tested and many of our younger players being tested. This was the first time that a season has gone to, an 18-week regular season, 17 games. And at the end of the 17th week, the Chargers were slated to be in the playoffs. Granted, we haven't played our final divisional opponent yet. I understand that. But in terms of the length of the season and how it must have felt for the players, compounded with the fact that it was a primetime game, it got flexed into a primetime spot. They were playing under the lights. And hey, it was win or go home for both teams. So really, this did feel in a lot of ways like a playoff game. And for the most part, both teams were pretty darn healthy. I know earlier in the season, the Raiders lost a couple guys, and I haven't really gone back and just seen exactly how large their injury report was. But it seems like they were fielding most of their stars. Most of their key defensive players on both sides of the ball were there and healthy and ready to go. And for the Chargers, I don't believe we were missing a single, starting player. I wouldn't call Bulaga a starter for obvious reasons. Storm Norton was our starter last season, as far as I'm concerned. But they had just returned, Storm. I know Filer had missed a game right, a little bit before this, but and Slater had even missed a game. And, I believe this was the first week that all those guys were back and healthy and playing together. We also had Kenneth Murray returning. Drew Tranquil had, been injured recently, but he was back. So although there were the nicks and bruises that come with a long and, intense regular season, our guys were, in the lineup. And when you watch them on film, it looks like everyone was feeling pretty darn good. Kenneth Murray being maybe the lone exception. The Raiders also represent a very balanced offensive attack to me. Statistically, this doesn't stand out on paper, but the lack of running game stats, I feel, is mostly due to the offensive line being in a transition year, which is hilarious because they, for some reason, decided to kick that can down another year and kind of, not address the offensive line like they should have in this season. But they had a very strong passing attack with some great wide receivers, multiple guys that could hurt you if you didn't properly play them. Derek Carr, I would never call him an elite quarterback. I'm sorry, Derek. I'm sorry, David. Get at me in my ats, or DM me. But he's not an elite quarterback to me. But he's a franchise quarterback. He's a very solid quarterback that's worth the money that they're paying him. Now, their running backs, I think, are, studs as well. I think Josh Jacobs is a solid running back that just didn't have a strong offensive line in front of him last year. but he's good enough to where if you were only cluing in on the passing game and kind of selling out to stop the pass and not addressing the rush, he's the type of guy that could punish you for that. And Richard is a great, change of pace back. So overall, I feel like it's a fairly balanced offense with playmakers on both sides or both elements of their game. Now, the major takeaways that stood out on film when I would watch this game is that number one, this might be a little clickbaity for some of you, but believe it or not, we were excellent at stopping the run when we chose to be. That's kind of the, the key point, obviously. When Staley ran his tight front, which is where we have the 3 down defensive linemen, versus what I like to call his light front. He calls the tight front, doesn't call the light front, but it's how I distinguish the two. The light front being when we only have 2 down defensive linemen on the field or one of our interior defensive linemen. The discrepancy in yards that we gave up was significant, both through the air and against the run. So that was my first point. When we were in that tight front, we were actually a very, very strong defense, and it was both against the pass and the run. So it's not like we were selling out to stop the run. Now, point number 2 was that our defensive personnel was not suited to run Staley's scheme effectively. This has been widely explored. I'm going to try to provide a couple new takes on it. I know there's one that we've also teased out on the show quite a bit. For some, it was just a matter of getting over the learning curve. I specifically can point to Asante Samuel. He makes a couple mistakes in this game and throughout the season where you can tell he was just learning and getting used to Staley's schemes and how what is expected of him. I don't expect that to be a problem this year. As Asante admitted in the offseason in a recent press conference, he really had to focus on his measurables last year and really just testing for the combine and getting drafted. So he didn't get to work on his craft in the offseason the way he would have liked to. I really expect after a full season within the system and now having a full offseason where he can work on his craft and really focus on the schemes and what is asked for him in these different assignments, that this has been a very cerebral offseason for him, would be my guess, that he's really picking a lot of this stuff up. And then the third point, Kenneth Murray, in my opinion, had the highest degree of difficulty of the linebackers. Now, there were some plays that he made substantial mistakes. Yes, I totally agree. There were also plays where what may have been perceived as a mistake by him or him being a liability in run defense, I believe was more attributed to the situation we put him in. There were multiple times where we would run this light front, as I've described it, with only Kenneth Murray as the interior linebacker, middle linebacker on the field. Call our edge guys not linebackers, and we'll just call Murray's position linebacker if that's easier. So we had essentially a 4-man front with 1 backer behind. And that wasn't always just in a position where the Raiders were in a very pass-heavy set. A lot of times this left us very susceptible to Murray getting, kind of left out high and dry, not having enough linemen in front of him to soak up, the offensive lineman's blocks, and always having a lineman or 2 that were able to get to him untouched and basically take him out of the play. That's something else we'll explore today. Lastly, taking the time out that was highly criticized, and I think by fans and pundits both, was, in my opinion, after really studying this tape, looking at the numbers, I can't come up with a reason why it wasn't a brilliant move that was just met with an incredibly unlucky result. Unless the Raiders, of course, made the play call of their lifetime after watching the film and breaking down what happened. But I think that's pretty unlikely. I think this really was just oh my gosh, I can't believe this happened moment. And we'll show you on film why that was. So first, let's break down this tight front. I'm sure most of you are already familiar with the tight front, but I'm going to break it down real quick. As you can see right here, it stops them for almost no gain. I don't recall off the top of my head exactly how significant it was. Nope. Yep. 1 yard gain on the play. So right here, you'll see we have our nose tackle right over the center, and both of our defensive linemen are lined up over the tackles. That is Staley's tight front scheme. Now, why this works so well against the run is it's very, very difficult for these offensive linemen who might be tasked with, you know, hitting a double team on their way to making it up to the second level, right? Help this tackle, this center, and this tackle here win their assignments with the guys directly in front of them by bringing a quick double team to put them in the direction you want them to go, to put your tackle or center in the best position possible to keep driving that guy away from the hole that you're trying to create for the running back as that guard slips up to the next level. I believe this guard here is actually going to double team the center, but each time it's still it's a very large distance for this guard to reach to get to that double team and then still make it to his linebacker assignment. So a lot of times you either see them whiff on the double team and then leave our defensive lineman in a, single position or in a man-on-man type deal with this tackle, or they don't get to the linebacker in time. So as you can see right here, that's effectively what's going to happen here. Number 70 is going to sell out for that double team, and he's already kind of engaged too far to make his way up and help with that linebacker. And Kaiser White gets a free run at the running back. When we had those tight front assignments, that is typically what you saw. It didn't even matter if we had one linebacker on the field or two linebackers. Most of the time, that whichever linebacker was on was actually able to get to the ball carrier without being touched by a blocker, or there was a defensive lineman, one of those three up front, or even one of our edge guys were able to, basically beat out a single blocker and make a play in the backfield. Whichever the case, it was ideal. Here's another one. This is going to be a loss of 2. This is an example of just there being so many guys up front that, again, we're in our tight front. There's a slight shade of the inside here, probably just shading over because of this, like balancing out, shading to the strong side just a tiny bit. And I mean, it's throughout the entire game, that is essentially what was happening whenever we were lined up in the tight front. We were in that tight front for 21 plays, and that's discounting the plays that penalties were called during. But when we ran that tight, our average yards were just over 2 yards a play. That is not running yard specific. That's including passing yards. So even though you might believe that we were selling out in a way to stop the run, there's actually no data to support that. Even when they passed on us in this formation, our players were playing very, very, very well against that, against both the pass and the run. It was awesome to see. If you were to average out our average run yards against the tight formation before the final run, and this is going to be a build up into that final point of the broadcast, guys. If you average out our run yards against the tight before that final run, we were only allowing 1.32 yards per carry. That's pretty substantial. Let's add another crazy wrinkle into that. There were a couple times that Mariota came onto the field and ran funky, gadgety plays that actually kind of worked pretty well for them in that game. Those are where the only 2 chunk plays, I believe one for 8 yards and one for 15, the only 2 chunk plays we gave up in the tight formation were on funky gadget quarterback read plays like that. If you take out Mariota and say, okay, let's remove the plays where Mariota's on the field. So if we know that Mariota doesn't go in with a sub package, that we need to send that tight out there and we're going to kick some butt. When Mariota wasn't on the field before that final run, we were averaging negative 0.14 yards while in the tight. So this tight front was our best formation of the game. Now, when we moved into that light front, just 2 defensive linemen or 2 down linemen on the field, we averaged just over 6.1 yards. And against the running and against their running game, we averaged 8.56 running yards allowed, rushing yards allowed against the two linemen front. So that is a significant difference between those two formations. And hopefully, there's kind of 2 points you can take away from that. One, the tight front is something that we can build off of because it does work. It is a very great arrow for Staley to have in his quiver. Number two is, why wasn't Staley's base nickel scheme working? Where was the biggest weakness in that? And what can we improve off of within that? Now, as we've talked about before, Staley's scheme is predicated on having extra DBs on the field with intricate overlaps in both pass coverage and run defensive assignments. I like to view Staley's scheme as overlap centric, whether it's the way he runs this gap and a half scheme, where as one of the down linemen or edge players, you're asked and tasked to come off the ball as if you were a one gap player. But instead of penetrating that gap, once you get to the gap, you are then tasked with kind of reading the play, analyzing if it's a run or a pass, and then kind of baiting to the running back to the gap that you have vacated to get to the one that you're at. So if you came off the ball and got to this gap over on your left-hand side, let's say you're looking over on your right and trying to wait for the running back to go into that gap, and you're setting up a trap to basically come across the offensive lineman's body that's blocking you and get to that player as he goes through the hole. An interesting thing and the reason why I call that still an overlap is you're overlapping into another gap, and there's often another player that's baiting the running back on the other side of that hole that you've created. That player is often going to that gap on the other side of it and has his gap on this, or has his eyes on the same gap that you have. So hopefully you're both coming together to tackle that running back. Kind of an intricate, crazy scheme. Now, the it kind of creates a scenario where the defensive linemen that can fulfill that role are very specific because they need to have explosive acceleration to get to their gap, be really explosive off the line, but they also need to have good leverage work and strength, be strong enough to come across an offensive lineman's body and kind of manhandle them really quick while get to that gap that you were baiting the running back into, which is kind of interesting. It's also, when I think of that overlap, I think it also plays into Staley having this, love for players that can play multiple positions that are very versatile. The Kyle Van Noy's that can play that, are slotted to play edge, can also be an off the ball linebacker. A Joey Bosa that is an edge player, but can come in and line up on the inside as well. Derwin James that hopefully gets flexed up to play slot a lot more, that star defensive back role, but really can do anything on the field you want him to. A Morgan Fox that is, slated to be a down lineman, but he's kind of got more of an edge-like body, kind of a tweener. That's another example of Staley's overlaps. And the biggest one, there's also a lot of overlaps in his zone coverages when he adds these extra DBs onto the field. That's why he likes to have them, is so he can have the zones play off each other a little more and kind of bait players into a space that then has a player coming into it to hopefully feed into a interception. But the biggest thing that we were missing this year is his insistence in fielding extra defensive backs compared to how a standard defense would play against a certain offensive formation. Requires your DBs to have this, be more of a two-way player, to be very proficient against the run, to have serious stopping the run skill and willingness, as well as contributing in the passing game. So when we weren't good, you can actually measure our success by how many extra defensive backs we have on the field. And like I had just said, when I'm measuring this extra defensive back idea, it's that, defenses get to make substitutions based on the formation that the offense is putting out. So a lot of times, and what most of us have traditionally known from defenses is they will try to match their cornerbacks with the other team's wide receivers. So if you have a set where the Raiders were going to send out two wide receivers, what's considered the standard is we would send out two running backs and two safeties. So we would have two additional defensive backs on the field when measured against their wide receivers. That's the standard. Now, the way I've measured this in my chart here is that two extra defensive backs or a two quarterback, two safety situation is what I consider even. Okay. Now, we often like to have one extra defensive back. So if it's a two wide receiver set, we would have two wide receiver set, we would still have three cornerbacks and two safeties. So that'd be five total defensive backs against their two receivers. That would give us one extra defensive back than what's typical. If they had two wide receivers and we ran with three cornerbacks and three safeties to give us a total of six, which we did 5 times that game, then that would put us in a position where we have plus two defensive backs over conventional norms. Now, there's a parabolic trend, as you can see here, of average yards per play increasing as we add these extra defensive backs to the field. So I think that's very strong evidence that even though we were kind of running a portion of Staley's scheme that he's familiar with and really likes, we still often weren't calling the zone coverage schemes that he likes because I don't think he had the confidence in the players to run it because it's a more complex scheme and idea. But his foundational philosophy of adding extra defensive backs to the field was really his Achilles heel because we just didn't have the defensive back talent to justify doing that. Yes, we have some studs, but we are very top heavy we're very top heavy with our defensive backs. That's one thing that should encourage you, even though I wasn't a fan of us picking up Taylor or Leonard in those later rounds, only because I didn't know them and there were still players on the board that I really liked. I really believe that Staley recognized that he needed guys that in his defensive back room that weren't undrafted free agents, that were guys that he was able to go out and seek and find to fill these roles and should pay off dividends in our season this year. So even though I didn't like the picks initially, my immediate thought was, this is an area that Staley knows he needed more talent. And I'm totally fine, even if other teams were willing to let them go and be undrafted free agents. I'm glad we went out and got the guys that we knew were going to be our guys. And I believe Staley has that. Are they going to be starters this year? No. But are they going to provide very valuable potential depth in this area that we were lacking so much? Yeah, I believe so. And if it's not this year, it's going to be the next couple years, as we transition some of our other guys out, potentially. Now, when we talk about having players on our team that were not really scheme fits, I can't think of a better example than Chris Harris. And I really don't mean to make this all about Chris Harris. I think he's a great player. He was a great slot cornerback in a cover 3 heavy scheme. But in a cover 3 heavy scheme, you have both cornerbacks on boundary cornerbacks playing the deep ball, and that freed up your strong safety like a Derwin James to ignore the deep ball and really prioritize the run or, work that sideline curl area, wherever he need be. But you had a bigger defensive back that would come in and be essentially the 7th man in the box that could really help in run support. That took a lot of pressure off the third cornerback to be a big, contributor in the run against the run. So Chris Harris was great when he was just able to kind of drop back and play a zone and be a twitchy guy. But in Staley's scheme, where there's only one guy covering deep, or it's a 2-man shell, and now he's kind of, both safeties are playing back, playing that deep ball, and now we're missing that larger, strong safety. And to make matters worse, we often liked having a 4-man front, 2 down linemen, 2 edge players, and 1 linebacker in the box. That really put a lot of extra pressure on our slot cornerback to be a contributor in the against the run. And I believe that's why Staley doesn't really like to typically call him a slot cornerback. He calls him a star player. That's a, unique term to Staley's defense, as far as I know. I think that actually might be more broad than I really understand. I kind of study Staley's defense kind of exclusively right now and just venture out when I'm trying to learn new concepts. But Staley really likes to use those star and money terms because you're not just bringing on a slot cornerback that's going to defend the run. You're bringing on a player that needs to be a hybrid guy that can really be a stud against the run. So Chris Harris, I really wish you well this next year. And I'm sorry it didn't work out, but you were just put in a really bad position, and it's really no fault of your own. That's about as politically correct as I can be about that. So here we go. Here's an example of when we're running our, light front. And what I like about this one too is, they have a tight end, lined up, and we still only have a 4-man front. And we do have 2 linebackers. So it's kind of 6 in a sense, but we're going to need Chris Harris in this star linebacker role, or star defensive back role, to make an impact here. Now, as Staley's scheme advances, this is another very big point, and he's more comfortable and confident in his defensive backs to do their zone assignments the way he typically has them do them, or has a shutdown cornerback, which he likes to have, which, he had in Ramsey, and why he went out and got JC Jackson that he did not have last year. He often would have a shutdown cornerback on the weak side of the field that would free him up to have all these intricate zone schemes in the on the other side of the ball, on the other side of the field. And it would free up the strong safety to play more aggressively against the run and then drop back to a shallower zone if it ended up being a pass play. I noticed that Derwin was not playing nearly aggressively against the run in this game because it seemed like he was concerned about his pass coverage responsibilities a little more than I would have liked him to be. So right there, typically in Staley's scheme, he likes having that safety come in and be an extra man in the box to make up for how light of a front he's running. And you can see that Derwin's already out of the play by the time the play starts. Like that's not happening the way we saw Staley do it with the Rams very frequently. So that one wasn't Chris Harris's fault, but there needed to be another player there in that gap that Derwin kind of was vacated from. Here's another example of our light front in action. This one is Chris Harris's fault. There's a couple other players that kind of botched it as well. And this one's kind of tough, guys, because I know I'm going to have dissenting opinions, potentially even within the Guilty as Charged podcast. But this is one of the reasons why I think Kaiser White was also let walk, because even though I loved him in our cover 3 scheme, I think he's a great, he can be a great linebacker in the right scheme. And I really didn't understand why we didn't try him in actually Chris Harris's role as a star defensive back, and instead of forcing being a linebacker onto him. But when you watch him against the run, this kind of stuff was happening a little bit too much. Just lowers his shoulder, doesn't really try to use his hands at all to get off this block, and instead actually turns his back on the play as he tries to kind of like run around the offensive lineman. Now, Staley, with all the linebackers he's brought in since he's been here, they've all been over like 235, really over 240. And I believe that's because when he runs these tight fronts, he needs a linebacker that can do that gap and a half scheme by being able to stand up to an offensive lineman right there and potentially come across his body, which is exactly what Kaiser White's job was to do here. But instead he lowers his shoulder and just, basically gives Jacobs a crease. Chris Harris is supposed to be right here, but he's off the screen. So this was a prevailing theme throughout the game, that the team or the Raiders could just kind of run to Chris Harris's side. Oh, sorry, guys. Chris Harris's side and know they were going to get a decent gain. Right here. This is just an example of our pass coverage being a little confusing for some of our players as well. A big part of Staley's scheme is if you're the weak side cornerback, which Zont, this is Asante Samuel here, which Zont is, if the player that you're supposed to be manned up on, which for him is this tight end, it's the number one receiver on the weak side, runs a shallow in, then you actually release him and zone coverages are going to pick him up and you come back and help in this deeper zone and kind of watch for crossing routes or just kind of watch for the next guy to come over to this side of the field. Now, this was actually man all the way across, I believe, with a kind of like a cover one. Nasir goes up high. Alohi Gilman comes in and covers the middle of the field. And Zont, once he sees that this tight end stays in the block, he bails out altogether and goes back pretty deep. And I think where he might have been confused is it really at this point still, if we were running Staley's scheme, wasn't his man to go get. That should have been somebody playing his zone there. But it wasn't the case. Zont should have stayed a lot closer and just covered just a shallow hook. Not quite. He could have played the flats. He could have backed up a little bit, but he should have known that if that tight end was just, staying in the block for a moment and releasing, that was still his man. He still had to stay on that guy. So he released and there was absolutely no one in position to make a play. And then Nasir just gets on his horse and almost gets us a turnover with that out of the back of the end zone fumble, which would have been great. Another thing to witness here is Kenneth Murray can take some notes in helping his teammates. He actually gets out of 87's way as he comes across him. He easily could have chipped him a little bit there and still covered Richard, but which really bummed me out. Although he actually saw that play developing, we just got there a little bit late. But if Kenneth had been a team player and given him a little something at the line, which he totally could have, although he would have been able to make a play there as well. So there's kind of a few examples of just our scheme mismatches. Now, a glimmer of hope for a bounce back player that gets a lot of flack. In fact, I just gave him some flack, so my bad. But Kenneth Murray definitely had plays that game. That was one of them that were tough to watch. There were a couple different times that he gave up plays or didn't look good on a play that actually wasn't his assignment, like that one, but he could have made an impact if he was a more aware player. But it should be pointed out that although we like to compare our backers apples for apples against one another, Murray was definitely given the highest degree of difficulty on his assignment. Oh, there should be a Y there, but it's not enough for me to reshoot. Not enough of a typo for me to reshoot. We're going to let it slide this time. Now, when we were running the tight with Kenneth Murray in it, we were actually averaging 0.43 yards a running play, which is significant, right? I mean, was right within, it was a little bit more than what most running plays were, sans Mariota. But, it's not like when we were in the tight, Kenneth Murray was still a major liability on the field. A big reason why Murray's stats might be significantly worse than some of the other guys like Tranquil and White is he was also on the field when we were averaging the highest amount of defensive backs, which, as I hope I've shown throughout this video, was actually our point of liability. The more defensive backs we had on the field, the worse we were doing statistically. And I believe Murray was, a victim of that. I really think Murray should be able to step it up as well because the linebacker's assignment in Staley's scheme is the easiest one. When we're talking about the complexity of Staley's defense, it's really mostly on the defensive backs. They have all these intricate cues on who to pick up and whatnot. But as far as the linebackers go, I watched this game a couple times through. I took notes of all the different coverage assignments for the linebackers. And really, when you break down pass defense in coverage specifically, there were only two plays that got called. One was manning up on the running back. Two was covering that hook zone in the middle of the field. That was pretty much it. There was one time where we ran a Tampa 2. And Murray was drawn back playing a very deep a deeper hook zone. And he saw Nasir bite on a route and leave a guy going deep on a deep flag route, I believe, either a deep flag or a deep post. And Murray hopped on his horse and tried to get to him to break up a play. That wasn't Murray messing up his assignment. He saw that Nasir had let somebody go and try to go assist. Luckily, it was an incomplete pass. There was another moment of variance where, if you watch the play, it might look like Kaiser White was following a tight end downfield, locked up in a man coverage on a tight end. But I watched that again, and it really looked like he was actually like we started in his zone, and based on what everyone else's zone coverages were, it looked like he just kind of got stuck on a guy and didn't let him go like he should have. So I called that a variance, but I really don't think that he had done what the play had called for him to do. It was just something he kind of just read and went with. So that was interesting to me. The only other things they really do is there's a very occasional blitz, which a linebacker can also do if their running back stays in to block. They are, cleared to try to go and get to the quarterback sometimes, or typical run play coverage. That was just labeled as that was a running play. Nothing else to say about that one. So the reality with this defense also is that, if you exclude the edge linebackers, and we're just talking about those off the ball linebackers or behind the line linebackers, we really field one linebacker very frequently, and it does not show a statistical or doesn't appear to have a statistical correlation in our performance. In fact, if you were to measure, how we did with a tight front and one linebacker on the field versus a light front and two linebackers behind it, we did much, much, much better with that tight front and one linebacker. So that might be something we see more of in this next season. But really, the average players at each position per snap shows that really if I just classified, defensive backs as defensive backs and not really differentiate between cornerbacks and safeties, the second linebacker that we field is actually the most frequently utilized rotational player. If you look at it in that sense, really we have one linebacker as our starting core, and that second linebacker is more of our most frequently used on the field for 2/3 of the time, almost like a what the nickel package used to be or something like that, or that third cornerback used to be. It's kind of that most highly used rotational player. So with us having the current room that we have at linebacker, where we have, a couple guys that might be able to be starters, but no one seems to be like a Pro Bowl type talent. I think we have very adequate depth at that position. In fact, it's one of the deeper positions I think we have in terms of who can replace who. It's just no one's really standing out to be a stud. Hopefully Tranquil can be that for us this year. I'm also really high on Nick Neiman. I've seen him do kind of those things in zone coverage that I mentioned before. I wish Murray did recognize where there's a hole in his zone and see that a guy's getting over to that area and kind of redirecting the player to give his teammates more time to make a play, that sort of thing. And Nick Neiman doesn't seem to give up too much in the running game either. He's bulked up a bit. So I really think that knowing that we only need to start one guy and then have another guy that's a heavy usage rotational player, that should give you a little bit more hope that, hey, we didn't go out and get a stud linebacker because we really don't need one in this defense. What we need is these defensive backs to step up and be studs. This one is, okay, so this is an example of when we had, I just mentioned this, a light front with two linebackers on the field. Or is that two linebackers? No, this is when we left Kenneth Murray on an island where there's a 4-man front. And Kenneth, I think, is our only linebacker. Yeah, that's DJ up there. It's not good, right? There's a lot of not good happening there. So right here, Chris Harris is over here off screen, and he has responsibility to read this run and then to be an extra body in the box. As you can see, Derwin's being that sub linebacker on this side of the field, which is nice. I like that. But it's a very tall task to ask Kenneth Murray to cover all of these gaps basically, and make a play wherever Josh is going to go. So Kenneth was kind of sitting right where he was supposed to be. Chris Harris really should have been more aggressive. I mean, it's very obvious Renfro's breaking down for a block, and Harris is still just going to let himself kind of get washed out to the outside. Nasir does a decent job of reading it and getting there quickly, but he does break down and mess up his tackle. He kind of lunged a little bit and didn't take a very great angle. Didn't really, just didn't look good. But I put a lot of fault there on Chris Harris for not reading that run sooner and getting himself in a position where he was making a play on the ball carrier. I don't fault that play on Murray. Now that we've gone over all this new information, it's a great time to bring up that infamous timeout. Staley faced a ton of criticism for calling that final timeout. And at the time, I was part of the dissenting crowd. I mean, had a drink or two in me, was watching the game, high anxiety situation. I was a little disappointed initially at first, but the plays leading up, the 2 plays leading up to that, and even a couple plays before that, I think, but the 2 plays leading up to that are very indicative to how that game went as a whole and paint a clear picture of, to me, why we needed to get a new personnel grouping out there. So just remembering how much better we were against both the run and the pass, but specifically, circle this, against the run when Mariota wasn't on the field, when we had that tight front down, it's pretty clear why Staley had to make the call he had to make. Oh, I need to transfer over to the video. Sorry about that, team. So getting to this video, this is 2 plays before the final 10-yard run. And I excluded from, I don't know if I mentioned this before, guys, I'm sorry. In those stats, you may have noticed I excluded that final 10-yard or that final run of Jacobs to basically put them in field goal range because I wanted to specifically tailor it towards Staley's decision-making as he, arrived to that timeout. So we're in the tight front. We are, we do have 2 linebackers on the field, making sure I have my correct notes on this. This was a rare moment where I believe we actually had 1 less defensive back against conventional norms. We had 4 defensive backs on the field, and they had, oh, no, sorry. No, we're even. We have 4 defensive backs, and they have 2 wide receivers. So we were totally even in terms of like running a standard defense compared to most teams. And boom, stop for -1 yards. So that was on pace with how the game had gone. Like I showed you before, we just broke into the negatives, -0.14 yards when Mariota's not on the field against the tight front when the Raiders were rushing. So again, you see it works exactly. Staley, calls for it. We actually had a little cornerback blitz, which is something different kind of wrinkle that we don't normally run. Now here we have our light front. Chris Harris, doing his thing in the I think he's on the weak side here, weak side support. And as per usual, it just gives up too many yards. They get a strong 7-yard gain. Multiple things go wrong here. And like I was saying before, in the tight front, it makes it very hard for the offensive linemen to get to their double teams, right? That's what we mentioned. They either get a double team and sacrifice not being able to get up to the linebacker, or they can't double team the down lineman because they're too far away. And that creates a just, mano-a-mano situation for that down lineman and frees him up to make a play on the running back. Here, as you can see, boom, 2 successful double team blocks against our impactful run stoppers, except for artillery. And it even gives that double team, gave them enough time to completely wash him out of our down lineman out of the play and still get to Kenneth Murray. So again, it's just that those shallow. Um, I don't like how that light front looks for us most of the time. We were in a properly situated defensive formation there with our five defensive backs matching up against their three wide receivers, but that light front just still rarely looked good for me. And our defensive backs still could have been a little more impactful coming in and reading run and getting there quicker. Our down lineman, certainly Tillery got, wiped out by a double team. And I forget if it was Jones there as well, but overall, it just was a very unimpressive showing. So after that, if I'm Staley and I'm sorry, I shouldn't have started the video yet. If I'm Staley and I am reading that, wow, if I'm looking at the stats and saying, wow, like we're getting our butts kicked when we're in that two down lineman formation or our base nickel, but we've been kicking butt in our tight formation. You better believe I'm not going to gamble on the Raiders deciding that they're just going to let the clock run down and, and hope that we just roll this thing into a tie. At this point, I think it was, let me see, they needed to get, it was third down and 4. Okay. And we were giving up over 8 yards a carry per average in our base nickel. So if he had any inclination that that was going to be a running play, the responsible thing was to get that base nickel off the field and get the tight formation in there. If you want to address, Kyle, why weren't we in the tight formation the play before? Why did we even bring out our base nickel? I'm okay with that question. I would have much preferred us stay in that tight formation, but some people still might believe that that leaves us too exposed in the passing game. I don't believe it, but some might. Now, why this was all just bad luck, and I will try to give like the closed captionings for people that are just listening in their car. But what happens here is Derwin has a responsibility for kind of like one of these gaps. I don't know which one because I've seen Bosa go outside almost as much as I've seen him go inside. He likes to try to beat offensive linemen on the inside quite often. And I don't know if that's supposed to happen in our run defense. Maybe Derwin's just supposed to read him, but Derwin's responsibility is to come in and kind of be that almost like a third linebacker right there. But this man in motion, number 7 is going to come in motion. I think that's Zay Jones. I'm not 100%. Or I don't think it's Edwards. I think it's Jones. Now, he sees that man in motion is going to, like, basically Davis doesn't see this man in motion yet. Davis is locked in on his man, and Derwin sees that Davis isn't picking him up. So he steps over to go, take care of that, whatever it was going to be, a wheel route or something. He thought the play might be going in that direction. Zont, who was manned up on 7, comes to fill that gap, or even if it was, I don't think it would have been, he would have come over if it was a zone assignment, but he does come over to kind of fill in wherever Derwin was supposed to be, whatever he was supposed to play in the passing game. He comes over and stands right where Derwin was supposed to stand, but doesn't really look down to see what run gap Derwin should have been in to go help pick that up. And it results in a 10-yard gain. So they effectively put a man in motion and got Derwin to abandon his gap and then ran it right to Derwin's abandoned gap. And if they knew that was going to be as successful as it was, I absolutely believe we would have seen that in more of their, convert and win situations because they had plenty of them. But that to me was just a freak incident that is just really hard to watch. So with that being the case, I hope you're all fired up for our week 1 matchup with the Raiders. There were things from it, even from a defensive side of the ball, that we can really build off of. And I hope this really articulated and showed why, our defensive backs were probably our biggest weakness on the defensive side of the ball. You might be able to say our interior defensive linemen or our down linemen, but as I think the tight formation success shows, when we ran that tight formation, we were a strong defense. And that kind of boiled down to those down defensive linemen. So I really have to bring it back to it really seemed like Staley was trying to run a defense with defensive backs that weren't really built for our scheme of play and for his scheme of play, and especially his lack of having a shutdown guy who he now has in JC Jackson that helps him, that his basically his Staley specific zone scheme where he kind of has a cover two or kind of a man up side of the field and then a like match quarters side of the field. It's a kind of this unique hybrid, but it all comes down to one player being able to kind of shut down the weak side of the field if there's one wide receiver over there, or just kind of come up with an exotic zone scheme off of that cornerback shutting down at least one strong wide receiver. What's going to be interesting is if Staley insists on having JC shadow the number one receiver, and teams learn that when they leave their number one on the weak side of the field, Staley loves that because he loves having his stud cornerback shut down the weak side of the field. Are they going to start hiding him in like a bunches formation or a trips on the strong side or something like that? And if we do, will Zont turn into the kind of player that Staley can trust to be on the weak side, shutting someone down in man coverage? These are the questions I have that I'm really fired up about. And I'm sure we're going to start seeing some very exciting things right off the bat in week one. Now, next video, I'm hoping to break down the defensive scheme in detail a little bit, specifically the passing schemes and the passing zones and everything like that, and how JT Woods, I believe, is going to be a key component to turning things around. I believe freeing him up to fill the star defensive back role, freeing Derwin up to play the star defensive back role by having a JT Woods and Nasir Adderley roaming the back of the secondary could be key to unlocking the full potential of this defense. And besides that, if there are any videos that all of you want me to, would like me to break down, or anything else you guys like to see, I love interacting with you guys on Twitter or in the comments. Feel free to hit me up with suggestions. Other than that, hope you all are having a great off season, and I look forward to sharing this whole season with you guys. Have a great one and bolt up.